was a Friday night and me, Jake, and Melissa had been planning this trip to the Texas State Fair for weeks. The fair was legendary. Rides that lit up the night sky, food stands that sold every deep-fried thing you could imagine, and enough noise to make your ears ring for days. I could practically smell the funnel cakes and corn dogs before we even got out of the car. Melissa, as usual, was hesitant about the whole thing. "I don't know, Ethan," she said, clutching her jacket like it was armor. "Fairs always feel sketchy at night." Jake laughed and nudged her. "Relax, it's just a fair. What's the worst that could happen? You might actually have fun." The night started great. We rode the Ferris wheel, stuffed ourselves with fried Oreos, and tried and failed to win a giant teddy bear at one of those rigged games. Then, as we wandered through the crowded lanes, a tent caught my eye. It was off to the side, away from the main attractions. A big sign out front read, "The House of Clowns, not for the faint of heart." The letters were painted in bright red, dripping like blood. Melissa stopped dead in her tracks. "Nope, not happening," she said. "Come on," Jake said, grinning. "It's just clowns." "What, are you scared?" "Yes," she shot back. "Clowns are creepy." I rolled my eyes but couldn't deny I was curious. The tent looked old, almost too old for the fair. The colors were faded, the fabric patched in places, but something about it pulled me in. "Just one show," I said. "Then we can leave." Melissa sighed but followed us in. The inside was dimly lit, with rows of creaky wooden benches facing a small stage. There were about 10 other people there, all looking as uneasy as Melissa. The show started slow, juggling, unicycles, the usual stuff. But then a clown with the most bizarre makeup I'd ever seen rolled onto the stage on a squeaky monocycle. His face was painted white, with exaggerated black eyebrows and sharp yellowish eyes that almost seemed to glow under the lights. Halfway through his act, he accidentally fell, and his bright red nose bounced off his face, rolling right to my feet. Without thinking, I picked it up, laughing as I held it up for everyone to see. The clown froze, locking eyes with me. His smile disappeared, replaced by something darker, angrier. "Keep it," he said, his voice low and cold. I laughed nervously and shoved the nose into my pocket as the crowd clapped awkwardly. The clown rode off stage, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. The night ended a little weird after that. Melissa couldn't stop talking about how creepy the clown had been, but Jake and I just laughed it off. When we left the fair, it was close to midnight. The streets were mostly empty, and the fairgrounds felt eerily quiet compared to the noise earlier. Jake and Melissa lived in the opposite direction, so I waved them off and started walking home alone. At first, it was fine. The cool night air felt good after the heat of the fair, and the distant glow of the city lights was comforting. But then I started hearing things. It started as soft laughter, faint and far away, like it was being carried on the wind. I stopped, looking around, but the street was empty. I told myself it was nothing and kept walking. Then I heard it again, louder this time and closer. A deep, raspy laugh that sent chills down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking more than I wanted to admit. No answer, just the sound of something scraping against the pavement. I turned and saw him, the clown. He was standing at the end of the block, barely lit by a flickering streetlight. He wasn't smiling anymore. In his hand, he held a long, rusty knife. "Give it back," he growled, his voice echoing unnaturally. My heart stopped. I didn't wait to find out what he meant, I just ran. I could hear him behind me, the sound of his shoes slapping against the pavement, the laughter growing louder and more distorted. I darted into an alley, hoping to lose him in the maze of buildings. By the time I reached my front door, I was drenched in sweat and gasping for air. I slammed it shut, locked every bolt, and collapsed against it. The laughter had stopped, but I could still hear his voice in my head. "Give it back." That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. The white makeup, the yellow eyes, and that knife glinting in the dim light. His voice echoed in my head like a broken record. Give it back. When morning finally came, I convinced myself it was just a bad dream. Maybe I was tired, or maybe the fried Oreos messed with my head. Yeah, that had to be it. I shoved the clown's nose deeper into my dresser drawer, hoping to forget it ever existed. At breakfast, my mom noticed something was off. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said, pouring coffee. "I'm fine," I lied, not wanting to sound crazy. The day dragged on, but things got weirder by the hour. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications, texts, calls, voicemails. But whenever I checked, there was nothing there. Just static. By the afternoon, I started hearing the laughter again. Faint at first, like it was coming from far away. I kept looking out the window, but there was no one there. I tried calling Jake and Melissa to tell them what was happening, but neither of them answered. The silence made my stomach churn. That night, as I sat in my room trying to focus on anything other than the clown, I heard something. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the window. I froze. My room was on the second floor. There was no way anyone could be outside. But when I turned to look, there he was. The clown. His face was pressed against the glass, his yellow eyes glowing in the dark. He wasn't smiling this time. He was grinning, a twisted, malicious grin that made my skin crawl. "Give it back," he mouthed, but I couldn't hear the words. I screamed, bolting out of my room and slamming the door behind me. My mom came running, panic on her face. "What's wrong?" she asked, grabbing my shoulders. "He's here," I stammered. "The clown. He's at my window." She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Ethan, there's no one outside. I've been in the kitchen all night. You're just overtired." But I knew what I saw. The next morning, I called Jake and Melissa again, desperate for someone to believe me. This time, Jake answered. "Dude, you sound awful. What's going on?" I told him everything. The laughter, the clown at my window, the feeling that I was being watched. He didn't laugh it off this time. "That's messed up," he said. "Maybe we should go back to the fair. Check out that tent again." Melissa was less enthusiastic when we called her. "You want to go back? Are you insane? That place was creepy enough the first time." But Jake convinced her, and by late afternoon, we were standing outside the House of Clowns again. Only this time it looked abandoned. The colors on the tent were even more faded, and the air around it felt colder, like the place was sucking the warmth out of the sun. We stepped inside, and the silence was deafening. No performers, no music, no crowd. Just rows of empty seats and a faint smell of grease paint. "Maybe we should leave," Melissa whispered. But then we saw it. The clown's motorcycle, tipped over in the middle of the stage. Next to it was a photo, old and yellowed, of a man in clown makeup holding a little boy's hand. "What is this?" I asked, picking up the photo. Jake's face went pale. "Look closer," he said. The man in the picture had those same yellow eyes. A voice echoed from somewhere deep in the tent. "You took something that doesn't belong to you." We bolted, tripping over chairs and each other as the sound of that twisted laughter filled the air. When we got outside, we didn't stop running until we were halfway across the fairgrounds. I knew then that this wasn't over. Whatever I'd taken wasn't just a stupid nose. It was something far worse. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every creak in the house, every shadow flickering in the corner of my eye, felt like a warning. Jake and Melissa had begged me to throw the nose away, but I couldn't. Something about it felt wrong, like it was tied to me now. I finally decided to get rid of it, though. I grabbed the nose from my drawer, stuffed it into a plastic bag, and drove to the nearest dumpster behind an old convenience store. As I stood there staring at the dumpster, I froze. I heard that laugh again, faint but growing louder, like it was coming from the walls around me. "Give it back," a voice growled, low and guttural. I spun around and there he was, the clown. His yellow eyes burned in the dark and his face twisted into a horrifying smile. "You can't get rid of it," he said, taking a step closer. His voice sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I didn't think. I just ran. When I got back home, my front door was wide open. My mom was sitting on the couch staring at the TV, her face pale. "Mom, are you okay?" I asked, walking in slowly. She didn't answer. Her eyes were glued to the screen. I turned to look, and my heart stopped. It was footage of me from earlier that night, running to the dumpster. The clown stood in the background of every shot, closer and closer with each frame. I grabbed the remote and turned off the TV, shaking her. "Mom, snap out of it." She blinked a few times and looked at me like she'd just woken up from a nightmare. What happened? I didn't know what to say. The next day, Jake and Melissa came over. I told them everything, the clown following me, the footage on the TV, my mom acting strange. "We need to figure out what's going on," Melissa said, pacing the living room. Jake pulled out his laptop and started digging. After hours of searching, he found something. An old news article about a clown named Gregory who had performed at the Texas State Fair decades ago. According to the story, Gregory had been accused of kidnapping a child from the fairgrounds. Witnesses claimed he lured the boy into his tent and was never seen again. Days later, the boy's body was found in the woods nearby, but Gregory had vanished without a trace. "Wait," I said, my stomach twisting. "You think this thing is Gregory?" Jake nodded. "It makes sense. He disappeared, but maybe he never really left." Melissa's face turned white. "So, what do we do? Just wait for him to kill Ethan?" "No," I said firmly. "We end this." That night, we drove back to the fairgrounds. The fair was gone now, but the House of Clowns tent was still there, abandoned and rotting. As we stepped inside, the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. At the center of the stage was a single spotlight, shining down on the monocycle and a pile of burned photos. "Bring it back," a voice echoed through the tent. I pulled the clown nose out of my pocket, my hands shaking. "Take it," I shouted. The clown appeared in the spotlight, his yellow eyes glowing brighter than ever. "It's not enough," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "I want you." Suddenly the tent began to shake, the walls closing in around us. The laughter grew deafening, and I could feel hands grabbing at me from the darkness. Melissa screamed, pulling me back. "Run!" We barely made it out alive, the tent collapsing behind us in a heap of smoke and ash. But as we stood there, gasping for air, I realized something. The nose was still in my pocket. I couldn't believe it. After everything, the running, the screaming, the tent collapsing behind us, the clown's nose was still in my pocket. I pulled it out, staring at it like it was a live grenade. "This thing doesn't want to leave me," I said, my voice shaking. Jake and Melissa stood beside me, their faces pale. "We have to destroy it," Jake said. "For real this time." Melissa shook her head, her voice cracking. "We tried burning it. That didn't work. What if it can't be destroyed?" I didn't want to believe her, but part of me knew she might be right. Still, I wasn't about to give up. We spent the next hour driving, trying to figure out where to go. Jake suggested a church, hoping a priest might be able to help. But the one we found was closed for the night. Desperation clawed at my chest as the laughter started again. Faint, but growing louder, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "This thing is going to kill me," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel. Melissa leaned forward from the back seat, her voice trembling. "What if it's not about the nose? What if it's about you, Ethan? What if you're what he wants?" The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. Could she be right? Was this whole thing some sick game to claim me as his next victim? "Then we end it," I said, my voice firm. "Right now." We drove back to the woods near the fairgrounds, where the boy's body had been found all those years ago. The place felt alive with dread, every shadow twisting into shapes that weren't quite human. Jake carried a gas can, Melissa held a flashlight, and I clutched the nose like it was burning a hole in my hand. When we reached a clearing, we stopped. "This is it," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. I dug a hole in the dirt, deep enough to bury the nose. But as I dropped it in, the laughter erupted around us, louder than ever. The clown appeared, stepping out of the shadows like he'd been there the whole time, His yellow eyes glowed, his face stretched into a grin so wide it looked like his skin might split. "You think you can bury me?" he hissed. He lunged faster than I thought possible. I fell back, scrambling away as he loomed over me, the knife gleaming in his hand. "Burn it!" Melissa screamed. Jake poured gasoline into the hole, drenching the dirt and the nose. Melissa flicked a lighter, tossing it in. The fire roared to life, engulfing the hole and sending the clown into a frenzy. His laughter turned into screams, high-pitched and inhuman. He lunged at me one last time, but as the flames grew, his body began to dissolve, turning into ash before my eyes. The fire burned out as quickly as it started, leaving nothing but silence and the faint smell of smoke. For weeks after that night, I waited for something, anything, to happen. But it didn't. The laughter was gone, the shadows felt normal again, and the nightmares stopped. Jake and Melissa tried to move on, but we didn't talk about it much. What could we even say? Who would believe us? Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself looking out my window, half expecting to see those yellow eyes staring back at me. But the woods are quiet now, and the nose, it's gone. For good, I hope. I don't know if Gregory's spirit is really gone or if he's just waiting for the next unlucky soul to cross his path. All I know is this: if you ever find yourself at a fair and a clown drops something at your feet, don't pick it up. I never thought cleaning up an old theater would be the beginning of my worst nightmare. It all started when I signed up for a community project to restore the Orpheum Theater in downtown Los Angeles. You know, one of those old historic places they keep saying they'll renovate but never do. It was abandoned for decades, and the stories surrounding it were straight out of a horror movie. Ghosts, strange noises, shadow figures, classic haunted stuff. On the first day, I was assigned to the basement. Great, right? A dusty, dark, creepy basement filled with forgotten props and broken furniture. I was digging through piles of junk when I noticed something under a dusty tarp in the corner. When I pulled the tarp off, there it was, a massive mirror. This wasn't just any mirror. It had this intricate silver frame covered in floral carvings, but it was cracked and stained, like it had been through hell. I swear the surface looked like it had smudges of dried blood. At first I thought it was just rust, but it didn't sit right with me. I dusted it off, and when I looked into it, my reflection stared back, but something felt wrong. I saw a flicker of movement behind me. It was fast, like someone ducking out of sight. My heart nearly stopped. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just shadows. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was a trick of the light or my mind playing games because of all the creepy stories about the theater. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. When the workday ended, I left the mirror where it was and headed home. My apartment wasn't far, just a small place I rented near downtown. The night was uneventful, at least until the next morning. That's when everything changed. I woke up and nearly screamed. The mirror, that same mirror, was leaning against the wall of my living room. I froze. There was no way it could be here. I hadn't told anyone about it, let alone brought it home. My first thought was that someone was messing with me, but my door was locked and nothing else was out of place. Trying to rationalize it, I convinced myself that maybe someone from the project dropped it off as a joke. But the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I walked up to it, and that's when I noticed something. My reflection was fine, but the background wasn't. There was a figure behind me. A tall, grotesque clown with a twisted grin and smeared makeup, just standing there watching me. I spun around, but again, nothing. The room was empty. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't explain it. The mirror was here, in my apartment, and now it felt like it wasn't just reflecting my image. It was watching me. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I could hear faint laughter. It wasn't loud or obvious, but this low, guttural chuckle that seemed to echo inside my head. I told myself it was stress. I mean, who wouldn't be freaked out by what I'd seen? But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The next morning, I decided to call one of my friends, Kelly, to come over. She'd always been the rational one, the voice of reason. Maybe she'd see something I was missing. When she arrived, I showed her the mirror. Of course, it looked totally normal. No creepy clowns, no eerie reflections. I told her about what I'd been seeing, but she just laughed it off. "Jane, you're working too hard. It's probably just in your head," she said, waving it off like I was a kid scared of the dark. But then, as we were talking, I saw it again. The clown. It was faint, like a shadow. But it was there. I pointed it out, shouting, "Kelly, look, behind us." She turned to the mirror, but her expression didn't change. "I don't see anything, Jane. You're freaking yourself out." After she left, things only got worse. That night I was lying in bed when I heard it. The same laughter, but louder this time. And then came the whispering. It was so quiet, I could barely make out the words, but one sentence kept repeating over and over. "Let's play a game." I wanted to scream, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. I grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, hoping that covering it would stop the madness. But it didn't. The whispers turned into banging, the sound of someone, trying to break free. The next day I tried to put all of it behind me. I told myself it was just a weird dream. But when I checked my phone, I noticed something strange. My friend Kelly hadn't responded to any of my texts. That was odd for her. She was the type to reply instantly. I decided to visit her place to check on her, but when I got there, her car was in the driveway and her door was locked. I knocked and called her name, but there was no answer. My gut told me something was wrong. When I got back home, I glanced at the mirror out of habit and froze. Kelly's face was there, not her reflection, but an image of her, trapped inside. Her eyes were wide with terror, and behind her stood the clown, grinning ear to ear, one of his gloved hands gripping her shoulder. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to look closer. As I did, I noticed something else. Photos. Small, faded photos of people I didn't recognize, scattered across the edges of the mirror. Each one had the same terrified expression, like Kelly's. And then I realized the horrifying truth. Those people weren't just reflections, they were real, they were trapped. The whispers returned that night, louder and more sinister. The clown's voice echoed in my ears, taunting me. "Your turn is coming, Jane, let's play." I knew I couldn't just sit and wait for my turn to come. The mirror had to be destroyed. I grabbed a hammer from under my kitchen sink, my hands trembling as I approached it. The clown's reflection was clearer now, standing closer, his grotesque grin wide enough to split his face. He tilted his head as if mocking me. Taking a deep breath, I raised the hammer and swung it with all my strength. The impact made a deafening sound, but the glass didn't even crack. Instead, I felt a sharp pain shoot through my chest, like I'd just been hit myself. I stumbled back, clutching my side, and when I looked down, I saw thin red lines, cuts, forming across my skin, mirroring the trajectory of the hammer's blow. I screamed, and the laughter erupted from the mirror. It wasn't faint anymore. It was loud, echoing, filling the room. The clown leaned closer, his yellowed eyes locking onto mine. "You can't break me, Jane, but I can break you." I couldn't breathe. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the room itself was closing in. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. And they weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from inside the mirror. The glass rippled like water as the clown stepped out, his long, gloved fingers reaching for me. His presence was overwhelming, a mixture of sweat, rot, and grease paint. I tried to run, but the room spun, and I collapsed to the floor. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was his face hovering over me, whispering, "It's time to play." When I woke up, everything was wrong. The first thing I noticed was the silence, no cars outside, no hum of the city, nothing. Just this eerie, suffocating stillness. Then I realized I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was standing in a dark, endless void surrounded by distorted reflections of myself. They were all warped and twisted like funhouse mirrors gone horribly wrong. And then I saw him, the clown. He wasn't laughing anymore. Instead, he looked almost content. "Welcome to my world, Jane," he said, his voice smooth and icy. "You'll fit right in." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't moving the way I was. It smirked, even as I cried. Slowly, I realized the horrifying truth. I wasn't looking at my reflection. I was looking through it. I was in the mirror. The clown laughed, and the world around me shifted. I could see my apartment now, but not from where I stood. I saw it from inside the mirror. My body was still there, standing in front of the glass, but it wasn't me anymore. It was him. He had taken my place. He looked into the mirror, into me, and gave a final, mocking wave. "Thanks for playing, Jane." I banged on the glass, screaming, but no one could hear me. Days, maybe weeks passed. The clown, now wearing my face, lived my life while I remained trapped in his world. And then, one day, I saw someone new. A man, maybe in his 20s, cleaning up what looked like a storage room. He pulled a tarp off a familiar mirror. I tried to warn him, but it was useless. The clown's voice echoed around me as the man stared into the glass, oblivious to the nightmare waiting for him. "Let's play a game." It all started on a chilly autumn evening, about a year ago. I was home alone in our little house just outside of Portland, Oregon. My wife had gone to visit her parents for the weekend, and I decided to take it easy, watching the Blazers game on TV. The streets outside were quiet, as they always were this time of night. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then, just as the game was about to hit a commercial break, I heard it, a knock at the door. It wasn't the usual polite knock. It was firm, deliberate. I checked the clock on the wall, 10:15 p.m. That was strange. Nobody ever came by this late. Curiosity got the better of me, so I stood up and walked to the window near the door to see who it was. What I saw made me freeze for a second. Standing there right on my porch was someone wearing a clown mask, or at least that's what I thought at first. He was tall, his face painted stark white with bright red smudges around his mouth and eyes. The wild red hair looked like it could have been a wig, but something about it seemed unsettlingly real. I rolled my eyes, figuring it was probably some teenager trying to be funny. Maybe a late Halloween prank. Either way, I wasn't in the mood. Still, I decided to open the door, just a crack, to tell him off. "Can I help you?" I said, trying to sound annoyed but calm. The guy didn't say a word. He just stood there staring at me. Now that I was closer, I could see it wasn't a mask at all. His face was painted, and the red around his mouth looked smeared, like he'd done it in a hurry. His clothes were normal, jeans and a hoodie, but the whole clown look made my skin crawl. "Look, buddy," I said, stepping halfway out onto the porch. "If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. Get off my property." He didn't move. His eyes locked on mine, and for a split second I thought I saw his lips twitch into a faint smile. That was enough for me. I stepped back inside and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I peeked out the window again to see if he was leaving, but he wasn't there anymore. Relief washed over me, but only for a moment. The whole interaction felt wrong. Something about the guy's silence, the way he stared. It wasn't normal. I tried to shake it off and went back to the couch, but I couldn't focus on the game anymore. Every little sound from outside made me jump. I told myself it was probably just some harmless weirdo passing through, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I had just started to calm down when it happened. A loud crash shattered the silence, sending my heart racing. It was the unmistakable sound of glass breaking, and it came from the back of the house. For a moment I just sat there, frozen. My mind was racing. Was it him? Did that clown guy actually break into my house? I stood up slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. My eyes darted toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. That's where the noise came from. I didn't have any weapons. Closest thing I had was an old baseball bat in the garage, but there was no way I was going out there. Instead, I grabbed my phone off the coffee table and crept toward the kitchen, careful not to make any noise. When I got to the doorway, I peeked inside. The window above the sink was shattered, and a large rock lay on the floor surrounded by shards of glass. My stomach dropped. He was here, I knew it. I looked around, scanning the room for any sign of him, but it was empty. No footprints, no movement, nothing. Still, the thought of him hiding somewhere in my house sent a cold chill down my spine. I needed to get out of there, or at least find somewhere safe to hide. I backed out of the kitchen and made my way down the hallway to the bathroom. It was the only room with a lock. Once inside, I locked the door, turned off the light, and sat on the floor with my back against the tub. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. There's someone in my house, I whispered. He broke a window in my kitchen. I think he's still here. The operator kept me on the line, asking questions I could barely focus on answering. All I could do was sit there in the dark, straining to hear any noise coming from the rest of the house. But it was dead silent. Too silent. 10 minutes felt like an eternity, but eventually I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As the sirens grew louder, I heard something else, a faint crunching sound coming from outside the bathroom window. I froze. Was he trying to get in? Then the sirens were right outside. Blue and red lights flashed through the window, and I heard the sound of car doors slamming. I unlocked the bathroom door and slowly stepped out into the hallway. I'm in here, I called out, my voice shaking. A police officer met me in the hallway and escorted me outside. As I stepped into the cool night air, I saw more officers sweeping the perimeter of my house with flashlights. The search didn't take long. One of the officers called out, and I turned to see them leading the man out of the woods behind my property. He was still in his creepy clown makeup, his hands cuffed behind his back. In his pockets, they found more rocks, big enough to do serious damage. I didn't know what his plan was. Maybe to throw more rocks at my house, or maybe something worse. But whatever it was, I was just glad it didn't go any further. The officers took the man to the squad car, his painted face still emotionless as he walked, though his smeared red smile made it seem like he was enjoying every second of this. I stayed outside on the porch, watching the scene unfold. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept asking myself, who was this guy? What did he want? An officer approached me. We've got him in custody, he said. He'll be processed at the station. Do you have any idea who he might be or why he targeted your house? I shook my head. Never seen him before. He just showed up out of nowhere. The officer sighed and nodded. We'll check him out. Sometimes these guys are drifters looking for trouble. Other times... He trailed off, not finishing his thought, but the implication was clear. Sometimes, it's worse. Another officer came up to us, holding a small plastic bag filled with items they'd found on the man. Inside were several large rocks and a folded-up piece of paper. We found this on him, she said, handing the bag to her partner. The officer unfolded the paper and scanned it, his face darkening as he read. He handed it to me without a word. My stomach churned as I looked at the crude drawing on the page. It was my house. My house, drawn in unsettling detail, with a figure standing in front of it. A figure that looked a lot like him. Beneath the drawing, scrawled in messy handwriting, were the words, "We'll see each other again." I felt the air leave my lungs. What does this mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We don't know, the officer replied. But we'll do everything we can to make sure he doesn't come back. They tried to reassure me, but the truth was I didn't feel safe. Not even after the man was driven away. Not even after the glass was swept up and the window was boarded. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every shadow felt like it was him, waiting, watching. A week later, the police called me with an update. The man had a long history of similar incidents, stalking, breaking into homes, terrorizing people late at night. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. The officer told me that when they asked him why he picked my house, he just smiled and said, "Because he looked fun." I never saw him again, but I'll never forget his face. The painted smile, the dead eyes, the way he made me feel like prey. I've since installed cameras, floodlights, even an alarm system, but none of it erases the memory of that night or the words on that piece of paper. Sometimes when it's late and the house is quiet, I find myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see him standing there again, watching, waiting, and in those moments I wonder if he really meant it when he said we'd see each other again. Working late shifts at Walmart in Aurora, Colorado wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. My nights always followed the same pattern. Finish my shift at 11 p.m., grab a sandwich from the deli, and eat in my car before heading home. It was my quiet time, a moment to decompress after hours of stocking shelves. The parking lot, massive and mostly empty at that hour, had an eerie stillness to it. I always parked far out, away from the store's entrance and the occasional cars of lingering shoppers. It felt private. But that night, something about the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt wrong. The flickering streetlights painted long, dancing shadows across the pavement. I brushed off the unease creeping up my spine. I was just overthinking. I unwrapped my sandwich, leaned back in my seat, and scrolled through my phone. That's when I noticed it. A figure in the distance, just barely visible under one of the dimmer streetlights. They weren't moving, just standing there, still as a statue. I squinted, trying to make out who it was, but they were too far away. I told myself it was probably someone from the night shift taking a smoke break. No big deal. I turned my attention back to my food, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. The tap on my passenger window was so sudden it nearly made me drop my phone. My head snapped to the side, and that's when I saw him, a clown. He was pressed right up against the glass, his painted face cracked and smeared, like it had been left on for far too long. His eyes, dark and hollow, bore into mine. He tilted his head, a slow, deliberate motion, as if he were studying me. I couldn't move. It was like my body had forgotten how to function. Then he smiled. Not the kind of smile you'd see at a birthday party. This was wide, too wide, his yellowed teeth visible through the smeared red paint on his lips. He raised his hand and waved slowly, his gloved fingers curling one at a time. My stomach churned. Every instinct screamed for me to get out of there. When he tried the door handle, I snapped out of my trance. I fumbled to make sure the doors were locked. Thankfully, they already were. He leaned in closer, his face nearly pressed against the glass, and mouthed something. I couldn't make it out, but the way his lips moved, it almost looked like he was saying, "Let me in." My shaking hands found the keys, and I started the engine. His smile disappeared, replaced by something darker, angrier. He slammed his palm against the window, the sound echoing through the empty lot. That was enough for me. I threw the car into reverse and hit the gas. As I sped out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The clown didn't chase me. Instead, he stood there, watching, holding something in his hand. It was a red balloon. When I got home, the street was silent, my neighborhood dark except for the faint glow of porch lights. I parked in the driveway, still shaking, and stepped out of the car. That's when I saw it. A red balloon tied to my car's side mirror. It hadn't been there when I left the parking lot. My heart raced as I untied it, my fingers trembling. There was something inside the balloon, a folded piece of paper. I didn't want to pop it, but curiosity got the better of me. The loud pop echoed in the stillness, and I unfolded the paper. It was a photograph of me, sitting in my car, eating my sandwich. And there, in the corner of the photo, was the clown, standing just outside my passenger window, smiling. The next morning, I told a coworker, Jake, about what happened. He laughed nervously, but his expression changed when I mentioned the photo. "You're not the only one," he said. Apparently, a few employees had seen him too, the clown. One guy claimed he found balloons tied to his car in the same lot. Another said she saw him standing at the edge of the woods behind the store, just watching. None of them had gotten as close as I had. That night, I parked near the entrance, under the brightest lights. I didn't even bother getting food. I just wanted to get home. But as I walked to my car, I saw it again, a red balloon tied to my car's antenna. My stomach twisted. When I got home, the lights on my porch flickered. I locked every door and window, double-checking each one. But around midnight, I heard it. A soft thump against the living room window. I froze. Slowly, I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. The clown was standing on my lawn, holding another red balloon. He didn't move. He didn't wave. He just stood there, staring. That night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. If he wanted to scare me, fine. But I wasn't going to keep living like this. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and waited by the front door. Hours passed. The clock read 2:43 a.m. when I saw him again, standing in the street under the glow of a flickering streetlight. His silhouette was unmistakable. The frizzy hair, the oversized shoes, the balloon. I opened the door and stepped outside. "What do you want?" I yelled, my voice cracking. He tilted his head, that same unsettling motion, and started walking toward me. His pace was slow, deliberate. The balloon bobbed with each step. My grip on the bat tightened. "Stay back," I warned. When he was a few feet away, he stopped. His smile grew wider, and then he spoke for the first time. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "You're part of the act now." Before I could react, he lunged. I swung the bat as hard as I could, hitting his arm. The balloon slipped from his grip and floated into the night. He stumbled back, laughing, a deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. I ran back inside, slamming the door behind me. When I looked out the window, he was gone. The next morning, I found a note on my porch. The show must go on. I quit my job and moved to another city. But even now, every time I see a red balloon, I can't help but feel like he's still out there watching, waiting for his next act. This happened years ago when I was still in college, working part-time during summer at Oracle Park in San Francisco. Late-night games were great for extra cash, but the downside was the long drive back home to Santa Rosa. Most nights, it was just me, the highway, and my thoughts. One night after an extra long game, I was driving home, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling in. The 101 was completely deserted, with the city lights long behind me. The highway stretched into darkness, surrounded by trees that seemed to grow denser the further I drove. About halfway home, something caught my eye. At first, it looked like a shadow moving across the road. I slowed down, thinking it might be an animal. But as I got closer, my headlights revealed something I wasn't prepared for. A person. No, not just a person. A clown. He was standing in the middle of my lane, his back to me. He wore a full clown suit complete with oversized shoes, and in one hand, he held a cluster of bright red balloons. His head tilted slightly, as though he was looking at something deep in the woods. I slammed on the brakes, coming to an almost complete stop. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I stared at him. Slowly, he turned to face me, and that's when I saw his mask, a pale white face with a grotesque, twisted grin. He tilted his head like he was studying me, and then raised one hand, waving slowly. A chill ran down my spine. I swerved into the other lane and sped past him, my heart pounding. In the rearview mirror, I could see him standing there, his head following the car as I drove away. The image burned into my mind. I kept driving, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. It's just some lunatic pulling a prank, I told myself. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the unease. Something about him felt wrong. Then the low fuel warning on my dashboard beeped. Perfect, I muttered, scanning the roadside for a gas station. Luckily, I spotted a small, run-down station up ahead. It was one of those places that looked like it hadn't seen much business in years, just two pumps and a flickering light above them. I pulled in, parked, and got out to start refueling. The air was thick with silence, the kind that feels heavy and unnatural. As I pumped gas, I caught a faint sound coming from the woods behind the station. At first, it was just rustling leaves. Probably an animal, I thought. But then I heard footsteps. I turned toward the noise, and my stomach dropped. Emerging from the shadows was the clown. He stood at the tree line holding the same red balloons. His mask seemed to glow under the dim light, and his twisted grin felt like it was directed straight at me. I froze. He let go of the balloons, watching as they floated into the sky, and then took a slow step forward. My hands trembled as I shoved the pump back into its holder and dove into my car. My keys fumbled in my hands, but I managed to start the engine just as he began sprinting toward me. I floored it, tearing out of the station, and didn't dare look back until I was miles down the road. As I drove, my thoughts spiraled. How did he get to the gas station so fast? There were no cars, no houses, just endless woods. That's when I saw it. A red balloon, tied to a stop sign up ahead. I slammed on the brakes, staring at it in disbelief. My mind raced as I tried to figure out how it got there. Was it him? Was he still following me? I didn't wait to find out. I hit the gas, speeding past the balloon. But as I continued down the road, I saw more of them, tied to fences, trees, and even floating in the middle of the street. Each one felt like a breadcrumb, leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. Then, in the distance, I saw him. He was standing on the side of the road, his white mask glowing in my headlights. Panic surged through me. I swerved to avoid him, narrowly missing a ditch, and kept driving. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the car steady. By the time I reached my parents' house, I was a mess. My mom and dad were still awake, and I stumbled inside, trying to explain what had happened. There was a clown, I stammered. He followed me. They exchanged worried looks, but I could tell they didn't fully believe me. My dad tried to reassure me. It's probably just some crazy guy pulling a prank. You're safe now. I wasn't so sure. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept replaying everything in my mind. The balloons, the mask, the way he seemed to be everywhere. I tried to convince myself it was over, but then I heard it. A faint tapping sound. I froze, my heart racing. The tapping grew louder, and it was coming from my window. I turned slowly, and there he was. The clown. His pale face was pressed against the glass, his eyes locked on mine. He raised a single finger to his lips, motioning for silence. I bolted out of bed and ran to my parents' room. By the time my dad checked the window, he was gone. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there. I packed a bag and planned to leave town for a while. But as I loaded my car, I noticed a red balloon tied to our mailbox. My stomach turned. I untied it and found a note inside. You can't run forever. I didn't even tell my parents. I just got in the car and drove. Hours later, I stopped at a rest area to catch my breath. The parking lot was empty and I sat in my car trying to calm down. Then I saw it, another balloon tied to a bench. I sped off, my heart pounding. To this day, I don't know who or what that clown was. I never saw him again, but every time I drive at night, I can't help but glance at the roadside, half expecting to see a flash of white. Because deep down, I know he's still out there, waiting. This happened years ago, but it still feels like yesterday. I'm 22 now, but back then I was around 14 or 15. It was a warm summer night in Eugene, Oregon, where I grew up in a quiet neighborhood. Our town was small, and everyone knew each other, which made it feel like nothing bad could ever happen. That day had been pretty normal. I'd spent most of it playing video games and hanging out with friends. The heat was almost unbearable, so we stayed indoors until the sun started to set. By the time I went to bed, I was exhausted, not just physically but mentally too. Little did I know that night would be anything but restful. I woke up suddenly, my chest feeling heavy like something had startled me awake. I glanced over at my clock. It was just after 3 a.m. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd just had a weird dream, but as I looked around my room, something felt off. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the walls, and everything was unusually still. My bed was right next to the window, so without thinking, I turned my head to glance outside. That's when I saw it, a face staring back at me. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but no, it was a clown. Its pale, painted face and oversized red nose pressed against the glass, eyes locked on me. My heart nearly stopped. I froze, unable to breathe, and as if sensing my fear, the clown suddenly ducked out of sight. My paralysis broke, and I jumped out of bed, screaming. My screams must have been loud because within seconds I heard my parents' bedroom door swing open. I bolted into the living room, still shaking, and they met me there, their faces half asleep, but quickly turning to concern. "There's someone outside my window," I shouted, my voice cracking. It was a clown." My dad grabbed a flashlight and hurried to check my room while my mom stayed with me, trying to calm me down. She kept saying it was probably a bad dream or maybe my imagination, but I knew what I saw. When Dad came back, he said he didn't see anyone. He checked outside, too. Nothing. "There's no one out there, buddy. Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" he asked, but his tone didn't convince me he believed that. I nodded. I wasn't dreaming. I saw him. They exchanged a glance, and my mom gave me that comforting motherly smile, the one that's supposed to make everything better. "Let's just go back to bed," she said softly. "It's probably nothing." I didn't argue, but as I lay back down, every little sound made me jump. I kept staring at the window, waiting, hoping I wouldn't see that face again. By morning, I started to question myself. Maybe it was just a dream, I thought. After all, we lived in a safe area, and weird stuff like that didn't happen here. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real. The next day was normal enough. I hung out with my friends, tried to distract myself, and didn't bring up the clown. I mean, what was I supposed to say? "Hey, I think a creepy clown was watching me sleep?" They would have laughed it off, and honestly, I wanted to believe it wasn't real too. That night, though, my nerves came rushing back as soon as the sun went down. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but when I walked into my room, the shadows felt heavier, the air colder. I made sure the window was locked twice, then climbed into bed and turned off the lights. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't shut off. Every creak, every rustle felt like a threat. And then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it, a faint, barely audible tapping sound. It wasn't a knock, more like something brushing against the glass. I froze. My stomach dropped, and every hair on my body stood up. I told myself not to look, but it was like I didn't have a choice. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, and there he was, the same clown. But this time, he wasn't just staring. He was smiling. His teeth were crooked and yellow, his lips smeared with red paint that looked more like blood in the moonlight. He tilted his head like he was studying me, waiting to see what I would do. I couldn't scream, I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, locked in place by fear. He tapped the glass with one long, gloved finger, his grin widening as if he was enjoying this. Finally, something snapped inside me. I screamed, loud and desperate, and bolted for my parents' room. I burst into their room, gasping for air. "He's back! The clown's back!" My dad didn't waste a second this time. He grabbed the flashlight again and stormed toward my room. I followed a few steps behind, clutching my mom's arm like a lifeline. When we got to the room, my dad froze. His flashlight beam landed right on the window, and there he was, the clown. This time, even my dad couldn't deny it. "Hey!" my dad shouted, throwing the window open. "What the hell are you doing?" The clown didn't answer. He just stood there for a moment, then took off running toward the backyard. My dad, furious, grabbed a bat from the closet and took off after him. My mom pulled me back into the hallway. "Stay here," she said, her voice trembling, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Then my dad came back, out of breath and empty-handed. "He's gone," he said, his jaw tight. "I couldn't catch him. He's fast." That night, we called the police. 2 officers came to the house and took our statement. They searched the yard and found footprints in the dirt under my window. "Looks like he's been here more than once," one of them said, which only made my stomach churn more. They promised to patrol the area for the next few nights, but even with that reassurance, I didn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that horrible painted face. The days after the clown incident were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I couldn't stop replaying the moment he stared at me through the window, or the way he smiled like he enjoyed scaring me. The police patrolled for a while, but nothing happened, and eventually, they stopped coming around. But I couldn't let it go. I needed answers. I started doing some research, digging through old local news articles, hoping to find something, anything that could explain why someone dressed as a clown was stalking our quiet neighborhood. At first, it felt like a dead end, but then I found something that sent shivers down my spine. A string of break-ins had occurred in nearby towns over the past few years. The reports all mentioned the same thing. The intruder wore a clown mask. Most of the time, he didn't steal anything. Instead, he would stand outside windows watching people sleep. In one case, the family woke up to find him inside their house. My heart raced as I read the details. This wasn't just a random prank. This guy had a pattern, and now he was in my town. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. I didn't even try to sleep. Instead, I sat in my bed, staring at the window, waiting. Midnight came and went, and for a moment I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. But then around 2 a.m., I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. The sound was deliberate, like someone wanted me to know they were there. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight I'd borrowed from my dad and turned it on. When the beam hit the window, my blood ran cold. He was back. This time he wasn't smiling. His face was blank, almost angry. He raised a hand and pointed directly at me, then slowly slid a finger across his throat. My scream brought my parents running. My dad didn't hesitate this time. He stormed outside with the bat, yelling for the clown to show himself. My mom stayed with me, trying to calm me down, but I was shaking uncontrollably. We heard a crash from the backyard, followed by my dad shouting. My mom and I ran to the back door just in time to see the clown vanish into the woods behind our house. My dad was standing there, breathing heavily, the bat clenched in his hand. "He's gone," he muttered, his voice shaking. The police came again, but it felt like a routine at this point. They took our statements and looked around, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no evidence, nothing. For weeks, I was terrified to sleep. I kept the window locked and covered at all times, but every little noise made my heart race. Eventually, life went back to normal, or as normal as it could after something like that. Years later, I moved out of that house and tried to put it behind me, but the memory of that clown still haunts me. One night, I was visiting my parents and decided to take a walk around the old neighborhood. It was late, and the streets were quiet, just like they always had been. As I passed by my old house, I felt a strange pull to look at the window, the one where I'd first seen him, and then I saw it. A shadow moved in the corner of my eye just beyond the trees near the backyard. For a split second, I thought I saw the clown again, watching me, waiting. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. But when I blinked, he was gone. To this day, I don't know if he ever left. The summer I turned 16 was supposed to be the most boring of my life. My parents made me get a job at the hardware store in Kenosha, Wisconsin, saying it would build character, whatever that meant. The store wasn't bad, though. The manager, Rick, let me work the late shifts since I wasn't a morning person. The downside? I had to walk home after dark because I didn't have a car or a bike. The walk was peaceful at first. 2 miles of mostly empty roads lined with dense woods that always smelled like pine and wet dirt. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like the world had paused for a second. But then came that night. It was mid-July, and the air was sticky and heavy. The streetlights buzzed faintly, their orange glow barely cutting through the darkness. About halfway home, I heard it, a laugh. Not the kind of laugh you hear in a comedy show. It was high-pitched, strained, like whoever was laughing was in pain. I froze, earbuds still blasting music, and turned toward the woods. "Hello?" I called, instantly regretting it. The laugh came again, louder and closer. It sounded like it was circling me, moving through the trees. My heart raced as I yanked out my earbuds and started walking faster, eyes darting from side to side. I made it home in record time that night, bolting up the stairs and locking every door and window. But even as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the sound of that laugh. The next day, I went through my shift in a haze. I stocked shelves, helped a few customers, and tried not to think about the night before. On my walk home, I spotted something unusual on the road ahead. At first, I thought it was just a piece of trash. But as I got closer, I realized it was a clown nose, a bright red one. It didn't belong there. It was too clean, too perfect. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. It felt wrong. Not sticky or slimy, just wrong. At work the next day, I showed it to Rick and the guys. "Look what I found last night," I said, tossing it onto the counter. Brandon, one of the other cashiers, picked it up and laughed. "You planning on joining the circus?" We all joked around for a while, but the longer we looked at the nose, the quieter everyone got. It was like the room's energy had been sucked out. Brandon finally tossed it back to me, muttering something about it giving him the creeps. That night I walked home with the nose in my pocket, feeling like I was being watched the whole way. It was around 10 p.m. when I first saw him. The walk home was darker than usual, with thick clouds blocking the moonlight. I was nearing the same spot where I'd found the nose when a figure appeared on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just some guy waiting for a ride, but as I got closer, I realized he wasn't normal. He was dressed like a clown, but his clothes were filthy and torn, hanging off him like rags. His face paint was smeared, and his smile stretched too wide, showing yellowed teeth. "You have something of mine," he said, his voice low and raspy. I froze, my legs refusing to move. "What?" "The nose. Give it back." I tried to play it off, laughing nervously. "It's just a stupid toy. You can have it." He didn't move, didn't blink. "If you don't, I'll take yours." That's when I saw the knife in his hand, long, rusty, and dripping with something dark. My fight or flight kicked in, and I ran. I could hear him behind me, his laughter echoing in the night. No matter how fast I ran, it felt like he was right on my heels. A pair of headlights appeared ahead, and I bolted into the road, waving my arms. The truck skidded to a stop, and the driver, a burly guy in his 50s, jumped out, yelling. When I turned to point at the clown, he was gone. The truck driver gave me a ride home, and I told him everything. He didn't laugh or brush me off like I expected. Instead, he frowned. "You ever heard of the laughing ones?" he asked. I shook my head. "They're part of some cult, or so the stories go. Used to be circus folk, but something changed them. They say they worship something that isn't human." I felt sick. "You're messing with me, right?" He didn't answer, just stared at the road ahead. At home, I tried to forget about it, but the internet wasn't much help. I found articles about disappearances, symbols carved into trees, and sightings of clowns in abandoned places. The worst part? A thread about people finding clown noses, always leading to something terrible. I decided to get rid of it, throwing it into the dumpster behind the store the next day. I thought I was free. But that night, it was back on my nightstand. The next evening, I was walking home when I saw them. Not just one clown, but 4, standing in a line across the road. The leader stepped forward, the same clown who'd chased me before. "You think you can throw away what's mine?" he hissed. I turned and ran, but they followed, their laughter piercing the night. I cut through the woods, branches slashing at my face, and stumbled into a clearing. Candles flickered around a makeshift altar, covered in symbols I didn't recognize. At its center was a pile of clown noses, all identical to the one I'd found. The clowns surrounded me, their laughter rising into a deafening roar. "You took what's ours," the leader growled, raising his knife. Before he could strike, a blinding light filled the clearing. A deafening horn blared and the clowns scattered as a truck plowed into the space. The driver was the same man from before, wielding a crowbar this time. "Get in," he shouted. I didn't hesitate. The driver didn't stop until we reached the police station. I told the cops everything from the nose to the altar. They sent officers to check the clearing, but when they came back, they said there was nothing there. No candles, no symbols, no noses. I felt like I was losing my mind, but the driver backed me up, swearing he'd seen it too. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on. I threw the nose into a river, but the nightmares didn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, heard their laughter. One morning, I woke up to find a note taped to my window. It read, "You can't run from us forever." I moved out of Kenosha the second I turned 18, but even now, sometimes late at night, I hear that laugh. And every time I do, I check my closet, just to make sure the nose isn't waiting for me.